He mocked me when I lost everything, sneered that I was nothing without him. What he didn't know was that I had already built my escape, signed it into existence, and buried it deep where he would never look. By the time the truth surfaced, his world wasn't just shaken, it was destroyed. The $97 million sitting in my private account would make sure of that. My name is Claire Whitmore, and at 36, I thought I had built something unshakable. 15 years at Trident Biotech, climbing from lab assistant to senior research scientist, developing breakthrough treatments that saved lives and generated millions in revenue. I was the woman who stayed late, who solved problems others couldn't crack, who believed that dedication and brilliance would always be rewarded. That Tuesday morning in October, I learned how wrong I was. The email arrived at 9:47 a.m., marked urgent, with the cold efficiency that only HR could muster. Budget restructuring requires immediate workforce optimization. Corporate speak for you're fired. 15 years reduced to a generic termination letter and a cardboard box. By noon, I was walking through the parking garage in Cleveland's gray autumn light, my box of personal items feeling heavier with each step. My keycard had already been deactivated, my access to the projects I'd poured my soul into gone. The security guard who'd greeted me every morning for over a decade wouldn't meet my eyes. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, staring at the building where I'd spent more time than my own home. The betrayal cut deeper than the fear. They hadn't just eliminated my position, they'd erased me. That evening, Mark insisted we keep our dinner plans with his college friends, the Hendersons. "No point moping," he said, adjusting his tie in our bedroom mirror. "Besides, maybe Tom can give you some leads. His company's always hiring. Administrative assistants." The way he said it like I was already something smaller, something diminished, should have been my first warning. We arrived at Russo's, the upscale Italian place downtown where Mark loved to be seen. The Hendersons were already seated, along with Mark's mother, Lorraine, who had somehow materialized for the occasion. She never missed an opportunity to witness potential family drama. "So sorry to hear about Trident," Tom Henderson said, cutting into his ossobuco. "Brutal industry these days." "Well," Mark said, swirling his wine with theatrical flair, "maybe it's a blessing in disguise. Claire's been so stressed lately. Now she can focus on more domestic pursuits." The table went quiet. Even Sarah Henderson, usually chatty after her second glass of Pinot Grigio, looked uncomfortable. "What Mark means," I started, but he cut me off. "Well, what I mean is that my wife has been playing scientist for 15 years, and what does she have to show for it? No patents, no breakthroughs, no real contribution. Maybe it's time she accepted reality." The words hit like a physical blow. Lorraine nodded approvingly. Her thin lips curved in satisfaction. "Sometimes we need to learn our limitations," she added, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Not everyone is meant for ambitious careers." Mark leaned back in his chair, emboldened by his mother's support and the audience of friends. "I mean, let's be honest, Claire's been coasting for years. Useless. Really. Living off my success, my connections, my reputation in this city." The restaurant noise, clinking glasses, muted conversations. The soft jazz playing overhead seemed to fade into white noise. I felt every eye at nearby tables turning toward us, drawn by Mark's voice, which had grown louder with each cruel word. Useless. The word echoed in my head, reverberating through 15 years of late nights, breakthrough moments, failed experiments that led to successful ones. Useless. I gripped my wine glass so tightly I was surprised it didn't shatter. My throat constricted, but not with tears, with rage so pure and hot it felt like swallowing fire. What Mark didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 6 months earlier I had signed papers that would change everything, hidden under my maiden name, protected by legal structures he would never think to investigate, sat the fruit of 3 years of secret work. a patent for a revolutionary drug delivery system that I had developed in a rented lab space outside the city, working nights and weekends while he slept. $97 million, already transferred, already secured, already mine. I smiled and took a sip of wine, letting the Barolo coat my tongue while I savored a different kind of vintage, the sweet taste of patience rewarded. Mark was still talking, still performing for his audience, completely unaware that the woman he was humiliating held the power to destroy everything he thought he understood about his world. "You're absolutely right, Mark," I said quietly, my voice steady as steel. "Sometimes we do need to learn our limitations." But I wasn't talking about mine. The humiliation at Russo's was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, Mark transformed my job loss into his personal entertainment, a running joke that he wheeled out at every social gathering like a prized possession. At the Brewster's Halloween party, while I stood in our couple's costume, a scientist and her successful businessman Mark regaled a circle of neighbors with exaggerated tales of my breakdown at the office. She actually cried when they took her lab coat. He lied, pantomiming my supposed tears. 15 years, and she couldn't even negotiate a decent severance package. I watched him from across the room, noting how his audience shifted uncomfortably, how decent people recognized cruelty even when wrapped in humor. But Mark was oblivious, drunk on his own performance and the encouraging nods from his mother, who had positioned herself as his chief enabler. Lorraine Whitmore had moved into our guest room temporarily after her apartment flooded in September. 3 months later, she showed no signs of leaving, and Mark showed no signs of asking her to. She treated our home like her personal stage for a one-woman show about proper family hierarchy. "Claire, dear," she said one morning as I sat at our kitchen island, laptop open, scrolling through job listings. "Perhaps it's time to consider more realistic options. The community center is looking for part-time receptionists. It would be perfect for someone with your current qualifications." Mark looked up from his Wall Street Journal, grinning. "Mom's right. Maybe start small. Work your way back up, if you can." He returned to his paper, dismissing me with the casual cruelty of someone who'd forgotten I was human. These moments weren't isolated incidents, they were a deliberate campaign. Mark had always been competitive, always needed to be the successful one in our marriage. When I'd published papers or received recognition at Trident, he'd found ways to diminish my achievements. "Industry publications," he'd scoff. "Not like real media coverage." When I'd been promoted to senior scientist, he'd immediately booked a vacation to announce his latest sales record, ensuring the focus stayed on him. But this was different. This was systematic destruction. The dinner parties became showcases for my failure. Mark would invite his work colleagues, ambitious young men in sharp suits who looked at me with a mixture of pity and superiority. "My wife used to pretend she was some kind of researcher," he'd say, pouring himself another scotch. "Now she's discovering what the real world looks like." His favorite story involved my last day at Trident. He'd invented elaborate details how I'd supposedly begged my supervisor for another chance, how I'd made a scene in the parking lot, how I'd called him crying and incoherent. None of it was true, but Mark told it with such conviction that I began to wonder if he'd convinced himself it had happened. The worst part wasn't the lies, it was how he told them in front of me, forcing me to sit there and smile while he rewrote our reality. When I tried to correct him once, gently mentioning that I'd actually handled the termination professionally, he'd laughed and patted my hand like I was a confused child. "Sweetheart, I know it's hard to remember clearly. Trauma does that to people." The gaslighting was surgical in its precision. He'd built a narrative where I was not just unemployed, but fundamentally incompetent, emotionally unstable, and completely dependent on his charity. His friends began treating me like a fragile decoration, speaking slowly and offering unwanted advice about bouncing back and finding my place. Lorraine reinforced every attack. At Thanksgiving dinner, she stood to make a toast to family resilience, she said, raising her wine glass, to supporting each other through difficult times, and to recognizing when it's time to accept smaller roles in life. Her eyes fixed on me with surgical precision. Some of us are meant to lead, and some are meant to follow. Mark beamed, raising his glass enthusiastically. The rest of the table, his brother David, sister-in-law Janet, their teenage kids sat in uncomfortable silence. Even they could feel the poison in the air. I raised my glass too, smiling serenely. To getting exactly what we deserve, I said, meeting Lorraine's gaze directly. She frowned, sensing something in my tone she couldn't identify, but Mark was too pleased with himself to notice. After dinner, as I cleared plates and endured more commentary about my new reality, I retreated to our bedroom and opened my laptop. The private banking portal loaded, showing numbers that would have made Mark's annual salary look like pocket change. 97 million growing daily through carefully managed investments. I closed the laptop and returned downstairs, where Mark was holding court in the living room, explaining to David why unemployment was probably the best thing that could happen to Claire. "She needs to learn humility," he said, gesturing with his brandy snifter. Success made her arrogant. Now she can focus on what really matters, supporting the family that actually earns the money. I sat on the couch beside him, playing the dutiful wife, the chastened woman learning her place. Inside, I was calculating. Every insult was an investment. Every moment of manufactured humility was compound interest on the revenge I was building. Mark had no idea he was speaking to a woman worth nearly $100 million. He was too busy convincing everyone, including himself, that I was nothing without him. Soon, he'd learn the difference. The divorce papers arrived on a Wednesday morning in January, delivered by a courier who looked embarrassed to be there. Mark had orchestrated the timing perfectly. I was in my pajamas, hair uncombed, holding a cup of coffee like some tragic housewife cliché. "Surprise," Mark said, emerging from the kitchen with his own coffee and a satisfied smirk. "I thought it was time we made this official." He'd been building toward this moment for months. First came the casual mentions of starting fresh and exploring options. Then the not-so-subtle comments about how some marriages run their course. Finally, the introduction of Vanessa Hale. Vanessa was everything Mark thought he wanted in an upgrade 28 blonde, and impressed by his BMW and downtown office. She sold luxury real estate to Cleveland's nouveau riche, which meant she understood the language Mark spoke fluently: appearances, status symbols, and the kind of shallow networking that passed for sophistication in his world. "She gets it," he'd told his brother David at Christmas, not bothering to lower his voice while I arranged presents under the tree. "She understands what it takes to succeed in this city, not like some people who think hiding in labs makes them important." Mark had been parading Vanessa around for weeks, bringing her to his office holiday party as his colleague, introducing her at the country club as a business associate. The pretense was paper thin, but it gave him plausible deniability and the thrill of public humiliation by proxy. Now, with the divorce papers spread across our kitchen table like a declaration of war, Mark dropped any pretense of subtlety. "I've been very generous," he said, settling into his chair with the confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. "You get the small savings account, your car, and enough alimony to cover a modest apartment. For a while." I scanned the documents, noting the clinical language that reduced 15 years of marriage to asset allocation and financial obligations. Mark had calculated everything down to the last dollar, ensuring he retained the house, the investment accounts, his retirement funds, and anything else of significant value. "Your lawyer was very accommodating," Mark continued, clearly relishing this moment. "He agreed that given your current employment situation and limited earning potential, this arrangement is more than fair." The lawyer in question was someone Mark had recommended a friend of a friend who specialized in amicable divorces. I'd met with him twice, playing the role of the defeated wife who just wanted everything to be over quickly. He'd patted my hand condescendingly and assured me that Mark was being quite reasonable under the circumstances. What neither Mark nor his pet lawyer knew was that I'd been consulting with my own attorney for months. Linda Vargas was a shark in a tailored suit who specialized in high-net-worth divorces and asset protection. She'd advised me to let Mark's proceedings move forward exactly as planned. The beauty of his arrogance, Linda had explained in her downtown office, is that he's not looking for hidden assets. He's so convinced of your helplessness that he won't dig deeper than the obvious accounts. Mark pulled out a Mont Blanc pen, a gift I'd given him for his last promotion, and placed it beside the papers. Just sign here, here, and here. We can have this finalized within weeks. Lorraine appeared in the doorway, still in her robe, but fully made up, as if she'd been waiting for this performance. I think this is for the best, she announced, settling into a chair like a judge taking the bench. Sometimes people grow apart. Sometimes one person outgrows the other. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Mark had outgrown me. I was the deadweight being cut loose so he could soar to his natural altitude. Vanessa's been so understanding about this whole situation, Mark continued, unable to resist twisting the knife. She knows how difficult transitions can be for certain types of people. She's even offered to help you find a place. Nothing fancy, but clean and affordable. I picked up the pen, feeling its familiar weight. Mark leaned back in his chair, victory practically radiating from his pores. Lorraine clasped her hands together in satisfaction. This was the moment they'd been building toward for months, my final capitulation, my acceptance of my diminished place in the world. You know, I said quietly, clicking the pen open, I've learned so much about myself these past few months. Oh, Mark's voice carried that patronizing tone he'd perfected, the one that suggested he was humoring a child. About resilience, about patience, about the value of keeping certain things private. I began signing the papers, my handwriting steady and deliberate. About how sometimes the best strategy is to let people underestimate you completely. Mark nodded sagely, completely missing the steel in my voice. Exactly. This is really about accepting reality. Claire, some people are builders, and some people are, well, support staff. I signed the last page and set down the pen. You're absolutely right. Mark, some people are builders. I looked up, meeting his eyes directly. And some people just think they are. Something flickered across his face, a momentary uncertainty, like he'd heard something in my tone that didn't match his narrative. But Lorraine was already reaching for the papers, eager to examine my signatures, and the moment passed. Well, Mark said, standing and straightening his tie like he was concluding a successful business meeting, I'm glad we could handle this like adults. Vanessa and I are having lunch at the Cleveland Club if you need anything. The Cleveland Club, where we'd had our wedding reception, where he'd promised to love and honor me 15 years ago. The symbolism was so perfect it felt scripted. After they left, I sat alone in our kitchen, soon to be his kitchen, and smiled. Mark thought he'd just executed the perfect divorce, claiming all the valuable assets while cutting loose his worthless wife. What he'd actually done was set himself up for the most spectacular fall of his life. I pulled out my phone and texted Linda Vargas, papers signed, phase 1 complete. Her response came back immediately. Excellent. Phase 2 begins tomorrow. The story began 3 years ago, in a cramped warehouse space on the outskirts of Cleveland that smelled like industrial solvent and broken dreams. I'd been working at Trident for 12 years then, watching my innovations get buried in corporate bureaucracy while Mark climbed his sales ladder and collected accolades for moving other people's products. Harold Bennett found me there one rainy Thursday evening in March, hunched over a microscope in the abandoned textile factory I'd converted into my secret laboratory. Harold was 72, a retired biomedical engineer who'd spent 40 years developing drug delivery systems before the industry pushed him toward forced retirement. We'd met at a conference 2 years earlier, bonding over shared frustration with corporate short-sightedness. Still working on the impossible, he asked, setting down 2 cups of coffee from the diner across the street. I looked up from the prototype I'd been adjusting for the 100th time that week. It's not impossible. It's just complicated. The device was elegant in its simplicity, a microencapsulation system that could deliver targeted medications directly to specific cellular structures, bypassing the body's natural barriers that limited drug effectiveness. Traditional treatments required massive doses to ensure enough medication reached its target. My system could deliver precise amounts exactly where needed, reducing side effects by 90% while increasing efficacy exponentially. "Show me," Harold said, settling onto the rickety stool beside my workbench. For the next 4 hours, I walked him through 3 years of development. The late nights I'd spent here after leaving Trident, telling Mark I was networking or attending professional development seminars, the weekends I'd claimed were spent visiting my sister in Columbus, when I was actually refining polymer compositions and testing delivery mechanisms. Harold asked the right questions, the ones that revealed decades of experience. He saw what I'd built not just a prototype, but a revolution in pharmaceutical delivery that could transform treatment for everything from cancer to autoimmune disorders. "This is worth—" He paused, running calculations in his head. "Claire, this is worth hundreds of millions, maybe more." "I know," I said quietly. "That's why I can't let Trident have it." Harold understood immediately. Corporate ownership meant my breakthrough would disappear into a bureaucratic maze, possibly shelved for years while executives played politics and protected existing profit streams. Or worse, it would be sold to the highest bidder, ensuring maximum profit for shareholders while patients continued suffering with inferior treatments. "We need a lawyer," Harold said, "and not just any lawyer. We need someone who specializes in intellectual property protection and knows how to navigate corporate acquisition without leaving fingerprints." That's how I met Linda Vargas. Linda's office occupied the top floor of a downtown Cleveland building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Lake Erie. She listened to our presentation with the intensity of a chess master analyzing a complex endgame. "The key," she explained after reviewing my research documentation, "is establishing clean ownership before anyone else knows what you have. We file the patent under your maiden name, Claire Morrison, through a limited liability company that we create specifically for this purpose. Complete legal separation from anything connected to your married identity." The process took 6 months of meticulous preparation. Linda connected us with patent attorneys in Washington who specialized in biomedical innovations. Harold used his industry contacts to arrange confidential meetings with potential buyers, never revealing my identity or the patent's connection to Trident's research areas. By September of last year, we had 3 competing offers from major pharmaceutical companies. The winner was Apex Therapeutics, a Chicago-based firm that specialized in revolutionary drug delivery systems. They understood exactly what I'd created and were willing to pay accordingly. The final negotiation took place in a conference room at Linda's office on a gray Tuesday morning in October. The Apex representatives, 2 executives and their chief scientific officer, sat across from us as Linda presented the terms. $97 million, their lead negotiator said, sliding the contract across the mahogany table. 50% on signing, the remainder over 18 months as development milestones are met, plus royalties on any products developed using the patent. I stared at the number, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd accomplished. 3 years of secret work, hundreds of sleepless nights, and countless lies told to Mark about my whereabouts, all crystallizing into a sum that would change everything. "The funds will be transferred to the trust account we've established," Linda explained. "Ms. Morrison retains complete control, with legal structures that make the assets completely protected from any future claims." Harold squeezed my shoulder as I signed the papers. "Your secret is safe," he whispered. "No one will ever connect Claire Whitmore to Claire Morrison's patent." The first wire transfer arrived the next day, $48.5 million, sitting in an account that Mark would never think to look for. The irony was exquisite while he spent his evenings cataloging our marital assets and calculating his divorce strategy. I was sitting on a fortune that dwarfed everything he thought he controlled. Over the following months, as Mark's humiliations intensified and his divorce plans crystallized, I continued meeting with Harold and Linda. We invested the money carefully, diversifying across multiple accounts and legal structures. By the time Mark served me with papers, my net worth had grown to over $110 million. The beautiful thing, Linda had said during our last meeting before the divorce, is that he's so convinced of your helplessness that he won't look beyond the obvious. His arrogance is your greatest protection. Harold had nodded approvingly. Sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight. You've been the struggling unemployed wife for so long. No one would think to look for a millionaire. As I sat in my soon-to-be former kitchen, divorce papers signed and Mark off celebrating with Vanessa, I opened my laptop and checked the trust account balance. $112,437,000. Mark thought he'd just executed the perfect divorce, claiming all our valuable assets while cutting loose his worthless wife. He had no idea he'd just walked away from a fortune that could have funded his lifestyle for several lifetimes. But I was patient. I could wait a little longer before showing him exactly what he'd lost. Spring arrived in Cleveland with Mark's triumphant parade of his new life, and Vanessa Hale was his prize trophy in every public display. They were everywhere: the Cleveland Museum of Art's annual gala, the West Side Market on Saturday mornings, the trendy rooftop bars downtown where Cleveland's aspiring elite gathered to see and be seen. Mark had upgraded everything. The BMW became a sleek Tesla Model S. His wardrobe shifted from department store suits to custom tailoring from a boutique in Shaker Heights. Weekend trips to Cedar Point became luxury getaways to Kiowa Island and Martha's Vineyard, each one documented extensively on Vanessa's Instagram feed. "Living our best life," read one caption beneath a photo of them at a wine tasting in Napa Valley. Mark stood behind Vanessa, hands on her waist, grinning like he'd won the lottery, which, in his mind, he had. The irony was that I enabled it all. While Mark thought he was enjoying the fruits of his divorce victory, he was actually burning through credit lines and joint accounts that still carried my name as guarantor. His lawyer had been sloppy about the financial separation, so focused on claiming the obvious assets that he'd missed the complex web of credit arrangements we'd built over 15 years of marriage. I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in Cleveland Heights, a deliberate choice that fed the narrative Mark had constructed. The building was respectable but unremarkable, the kind of place where a recently divorced woman might land after losing everything. I furnished it with pieces from discount stores and estate sales, creating the perfect backdrop for my new role as the struggling ex-wife. The performance required constant attention to detail. I shopped at discount grocery stores, clipped coupons, and made sure to be seen doing it. When I ran into mutual acquaintances at the coffee shop or library, I wore my financial hardship like a carefully fitted costume, not quite desperate enough to inspire pity, but clearly diminished from my former status. "How are you holding up?" Sarah Henderson asked when she encountered me at the farmer's market one Saturday morning. I was examining vegetables with the focused intensity of someone calculating every dollar. "One day at a time," I replied, managing a brave smile while clutching a handful of discount coupons. "It's an adjustment, but I'm managing." Sarah's eyes filled with the kind of sympathy reserved for casualties of divorce warfare. "If you need anything, references for jobs, or just someone to talk to." "Thank you. That means more than you know." The conversation would be repeated to her husband Tom by dinner time, adding another thread to the narrative web that was spreading through our social circle. Poor Claire, struggling to make ends meet while Mark flourished with his young girlfriend. Meanwhile, twice a week, I met discreetly with Scott Harmon at his office in the Hanna Building downtown. Scott was a financial advisor who specialized in high-net-worth clients, recommended by Linda Vargas for his discretion and expertise in complex investment strategies. "Your portfolio is performing exceptionally well," Scott reported during our Tuesday afternoon meeting in April. "The diversification strategy we implemented is yielding consistent returns across multiple sectors." My fortune had grown to $118 million, carefully distributed across international markets, real estate investments, and emerging technology funds. Scott had been methodical about expansion, ensuring that my wealth would continue growing regardless of market fluctuations. "The pharmaceutical sector investments are particularly strong," he continued, pulling up charts on his computer screen. Apex Therapeutics announced their partnership with European distributors last week. Your royalty stream should increase significantly over the next quarter. I nodded, taking notes in a leather portfolio that never left Scott's office. Everything about our meetings was designed for complete confidentiality, scheduled during business hours when Mark would be working, held in a building where I had no reason to be seen, documented only in Scott's secure files. "There's something else," Scott said, his tone shifting slightly. "I've been monitoring the credit activity you asked me to track. Your ex-husband's spending has accelerated significantly." Scott pulled up a different screen, showing credit card statements and loan activity across multiple accounts. Mark's expenditures were staggering: luxury travel, expensive restaurants, jewelry purchases that clearly weren't for him. He was living like a man with unlimited resources, apparently unaware that his credit was largely secured by assets that no longer existed or guarantees I could revoke at any time. "He's borrowed against the house twice since the divorce," Scott explained. "Took a personal loan for $60,000 last month, and there are multiple credit cards with your name still attached as cosigner or guarantor." "How much total exposure?" I asked. "Conservative estimate $340,000 in direct liability, but if his income stream were interrupted or his credit access eliminated, he'd be destroyed financially within weeks," I finished. Scott nodded. "The interesting thing is that most of these arrangements should have been severed during the divorce proceedings. Your ex-husband's attorney seems to have been remarkably careless about cleaning up the financial entanglements. Or remarkably arrogant. I thought. Mark's lawyer had been so focused on claiming the obvious assets: the house, the retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, that he'd overlooked the complex credit structures that actually funded Mark's lifestyle. Through Scott's careful monitoring, I watched Mark's spending spree reach increasingly reckless heights. A weekend in Miami that cost $12,000, a Rolex Submariner for $15,000, a surprise trip to Paris that Vanessa documented with dozens of photos from the Ritz-Carlton. Each expenditure was an investment in my eventual revenge. Mark was building his new life on borrowed money and borrowed time, completely unaware that the foundation was sand and the woman he'd discarded held the power to wash it all away. "Well, when would you like to begin the next phase?" Scott asked as our meeting concluded. I gathered my notes and closed the portfolio. "Soon, but not yet. Let him get a little higher first. The fall will be so much more satisfying from a greater height." Walking back to my modest apartment, I passed a jewelry store window displaying engagement rings and smiled. Mark was probably in there right now, or would be soon, planning his next grand gesture for Vanessa. Let him spend, let him borrow, let him build his castle in the clouds. I had all the time in the world to choose the perfect moment to bring it crashing down. The moment I'd been waiting for arrived on a humid Tuesday evening in July, disguised as a chance encounter at the grocery store. I was in the cereal aisle of the Giant Eagle on Cedar Road, playing my role as the budget-conscious divorcee, when I spotted Janet Whitmore, Mark's sister-in-law, pushing her cart toward me with the determined stride of someone who had gossip to share. "Claire," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're about to deliver information they think you need to hear. "How wonderful to run into you." Janet had always been the family member most uncomfortable with Mark's treatment of me. During the divorce proceedings, she'd maintained a careful neutrality, but I could see the disapproval in her eyes whenever Mark performed his cruelty in public. "Hi, Janet," I replied, holding up a box of store-brand cereal with practiced resignation. "How are David and the kids?" "Oh, they're wonderful. Tommy made varsity soccer, and Sarah's starting her senior year." She paused, studying my cart with its careful collection of discount items and coupons. "Listen, Claire, I probably shouldn't say anything, but, well, I thought you should know." "Here it comes," I thought, arranging my expression into one of wary curiosity. "David got a call from Mark last week. About money." Janet glanced around the aisle, making sure we were alone. "Apparently, Mark's been having some cash flow issues. He asked David for a loan, a significant one. "Oh," I said, allowing concern to creep into my voice.
Is everything okay?
"Well, that's just it." David said Mark seemed confident it was just temporary. Something about credit lines being reorganized. But then yesterday, Janet lowered her voice to a whisper. David saw the credit card statement. The one for the card you and Mark used to share. The one with your name on it. My heart began to race, but not from anxiety, from anticipation. "Mark's been using it," Janet continued. "A lot. David said the balance was over $40,000 just from the past 2 months. Trips, restaurants, jewelry purchases. David's worried because, technically, you're still responsible for that debt." I let my face register the appropriate shock and dismay. What but the divorce? I thought all that was supposed to be separated. "That's what David said. He thinks Mark's lawyer made a mistake. Or maybe Mark just forgot to mention some of the accounts." Janet reached out and touched my arm gently. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but David thought you should know before it gets worse." After Janet left, I finished my shopping with deliberate calm, my mind racing through the implications. This was even better than I'd hoped. Not only was Mark still using credit lines tied to my name, but he was doing it so recklessly that even his own family was noticing. That evening, I called Scott Harmon from my apartment. "I need you to pull a complete credit report," I said without preamble. "Every account, every guarantee, every piece of paper with my name on it that Mark might still be using." Scott's investigation revealed the full scope of Mark's financial recklessness. Over the past 6 months, he'd run up nearly $200,000 in debt across multiple credit lines that hadn't been properly severed during the divorce. The jewelry store purchases, the luxury travel, the expensive dinners, all of it charged to accounts where I remained legally liable. "The interesting thing," Scott explained during our emergency meeting the next day, "is that he's not just spending frivolously, he's borrowed against future income streams, taken cash advances, and even used some of these credit lines as collateral for other loans. It's a house of cards built on accounts he doesn't technically control." "Well, what happens if I revoke my guarantees and freeze the accounts?" I asked. "Financial catastrophe. Within days, possibly hours. Every automatic payment fails, every pending transaction bounces, and the cascade effect hits every other financial arrangement he's made. Credit score destroyed, loans called in, potential bankruptcy." The beauty of it was surgical. Mark had spent months constructing an elaborate lifestyle funded by credit he didn't realize could be pulled away at any moment. He'd gotten careless, confident that his divorce victory had secured his financial independence. "There's more," Scott continued, pulling up another screen. "I did some discreet investigation into his employment situation. Mark's company has been struggling. They've had layoffs in his division, and his sales numbers have been declining for 2 quarters. If his credit situation imploded, it could affect his professional standing as well." Perfect. Mark had built his new life on multiple levels of borrowed time financially, professionally, and personally. All of it dependent on maintaining an image of success that was entirely fabricated. I thought about Vanessa, probably at that moment planning their next expensive getaway, completely unaware that her boyfriend's wealth was an elaborate illusion funded by his ex-wife's credit, the same ex-wife he'd publicly humiliated for months as a helpless failure. "When do you want to execute?" Scott asked. I considered the timing carefully. Mark's birthday was approaching August 15th. He'd probably planned something spectacular for Vanessa, another grand gesture to cement his image as the successful man who'd upgraded from his worthless first wife. "I want to wait until he's at maximum exposure," I said finally. "Let him plan something big for his birthday. Let him get confident. Then, when he's most committed to maintaining his facade." "You pull the rug out," Scott finished, nodding approvingly. "Not just the rug, the entire floor." Over the following weeks, I watched Mark's social media feeds and heard gossip through mutual acquaintances about his birthday plans. A weekend at the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia. A surprise party with 50 guests. a custom-designed diamond necklace for Vanessa that cost more than most people's cars. All of it funded by credit he thought was his to use indefinitely. All of it about to disappear. On August 10th, 5 days before Mark's birthday celebration, I gave Scott the final authorization. "Do it," I said during our morning phone call. "Freeze everything. Revoke all guarantees. Demand immediate payment on every outstanding balance." "Consider it done," Scott replied. "By close of business today, Mr. Whitmore's access to credit will be completely severed." I hung up the phone and smiled, imagining the calls Mark would start receiving within hours, the declined transactions, the automated notices, the slowly dawning realization that his carefully constructed new life was about to collapse entirely. The countdown to his birthday had begun, but Mark had no idea he was about to receive the most devastating gift of his life. The text came at 11:37 p.m. on Friday, 3 days after I'd frozen the accounts. "We need to talk, tomorrow. Russo's, 2 o'clock. No greeting, no signature, just the demanding tone of a man who still believed he held authority over me. I stared at the message, savoring the desperation hidden beneath Mark's attempt at control. Russo's the same restaurant where he'd publicly humiliated me 9 months earlier, calling me useless in front of our friends. The symmetry was too perfect to be coincidental. Mark was either oblivious to the irony or desperately hoping to reclaim some psychological advantage by returning to the scene of his previous triumph. I arrived 15 minutes early, requesting the same table where we'd sat that awful October evening. The hostess remembered me. Divorced women who dine alone tend to leave impressions, and her sympathetic smile suggested she'd heard about my difficult circumstances through Cleveland's efficient gossip network. I ordered coffee and waited, watching the lunch crowd filter in. Business executives celebrating deals, ladies who lunched discussing charity galas, young couples sharing appetizers and dreams. The same backdrop that had witnessed my public destruction was about to host Mark's private demolition. He arrived 12 minutes late, and the change was immediately obvious. The confident swagger had been replaced by jerky, agitated movements. His usually perfect hair looked disheveled, and his expensive shirt, probably purchased during his recent spending spree, was wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. Mark slumped into the chair across from me, scanning the restaurant like a hunted animal checking for predators. "Claire." His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the panic underneath. "Hello, Mark. You look tired." "Cut the bullshit." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "What did you do?" I tilted my head, arranging my features into an expression of confused innocence. "I'm sorry. What did I do about what?" "The accounts, the credit cards, everything's frozen. Every goddamn thing." His hands were shaking slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. "My bank called yesterday saying there were irregularities with my credit arrangements. Then, this morning, my American Express was declined. Declined. Claire, at the fucking gas station." The profanity was new. Mark had always prided himself on maintaining a polished public image, never lowering himself to crude language where others might hear. The fact that he was swearing in a restaurant full of Cleveland's social climbers showed just how far he'd fallen. "That sounds awful," I said, injecting just the right amount of sympathy into my voice. "But I don't understand what it has to do with me. We've been divorced for months." "Don't play dumb. You know exactly what this is about." Mark ran his hands through his hair, destroying what remained of his careful styling. "Somehow you're connected to these accounts. The bank mentioned your name as a guarantor or co-signer or some legal shit I don't understand." "Oh," I paused, as if a memory was slowly dawning. "You mean the old joint accounts, the ones your lawyer was supposed to handle during the divorce." Mark's face went pale. "What are you talking about? Richard took care of all that." "Did he? Because I've been getting some very interesting phone calls from creditors lately. Apparently, there are quite a few accounts that were never properly separated, accounts where I'm still legally responsible for the debt." The color drained completely from Mark's face as the implications hit him. For months. He'd been living like a king on credit that was ultimately backed by the woman he'd discarded as worthless.
You can't. You wouldn't.
He was struggling to form complete sentences, his confidence crumbling in real time. Wouldn't what protect myself from financial liability, Mark? I'm unemployed. Remember, according to you, I'm useless, broke, struggling to make ends meet. I can't afford to be responsible for hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt that someone else accumulated. The restaurant's ambient noise, clinking silverware, muted conversations. Soft jazz seemed to amplify in the silence that followed. Mark stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years.
You did this on purpose,
he whispered. You've been planning this. Before I could respond, Vanessa appeared at our table like a vision from Mark's former life. She was dressed for success designer suit, perfect makeup, the confidence of a woman who believed she was winning. Clearly, Mark hadn't told her about his financial crisis. Darling, sorry I'm late. The Henderson listing finally. Vanessa stopped mid-sentence, noticing the tension at our table. Her eyes flicked between Mark's stricken face and my calm composure. Is everything all right? Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. The man who had spent months boasting about his upgrade, his success, his escape from his worthless first wife, couldn't find his voice. Well, we're just discussing some financial matters, I said pleasantly. Old business from the divorce that apparently wasn't handled properly. Vanessa's professional instincts kicked in as a realtor. She understood that financial irregularities could destroy everything. What kind of financial matters? I reached into my purse and withdrew a manila envelope that Linda Vargas had prepared for this moment. The kind that might interest you. Actually, since you're planning to build a future with Mark. With deliberate precision, I spread the documents across the table. Credit reports showing hundreds of thousands in debt. Bank notices demanding immediate payment. Most damning of all, the patent sale documents showing my true financial position. Claire Morrison, inventor and patent holder, worth over $120 million. Vanessa's eyes widened as she scanned the papers, her quick mind processing the implications. Mark sat frozen, watching his carefully constructed world disintegrate in real time. This shows... Vanessa's voice trailed off as she reached the patent documents. You sold a patent for $97 million. Actually, with investments and royalties, it's considerably more now. I leaned back in my chair, finally allowing myself to enjoy this moment I'd been building toward for months. Funny how everyone assumed I was unemployed and worthless, when really I was just discreet about my success. Mark was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. This is impossible. You don't have this kind of money. You can't. You're living in that shitty apartment, shopping with coupons. Acting, I said simply. I've been acting, Mark, playing the role you assigned me, the defeated ex-wife, struggling to survive without your support. It was quite convincing, wasn't it? Vanessa stood abruptly, the papers scattering as she backed away from the table. Mark, is this real? Are you actually broke? Have you been lying to me about everything? Mark looked up at her, his mouth opening and closing like a drowning man gasping for air. The truth was written all over his face, and Vanessa, successful realtor, social climber, woman who'd built her life on reading people and situations, saw it immediately. Oh my God, she whispered. You don't have any money. You've been spending... What? Her money. Money you didn't even know was hers. Vanessa, wait, I can explain. But Vanessa was already walking away, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the sharp staccato of a woman who'd just realized she'd been playing a rigged game. Mark turned back to me, his face a mask of devastation and rage. You destroyed me! No, Mark, I said, gathering the papers and sliding them back into the envelope. You destroyed yourself. I just stopped enabling it. Mark slumped forward in his chair, the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. The confident man who had mocked me, humiliated me, and discarded me like garbage was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized hollow, defeated, broken. "How long?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. "How long have you been planning this?" I considered the question, thinking back to that first night in my secret laboratory 3 years ago, when Harold Bennett had looked at my prototype and recognized its world-changing potential. But the real answer went deeper than that, back to years of subtle undermining, dismissive comments, and the gradual erosion of my sense of self-worth under Mark's calculated cruelty. "The patent work started 3 years ago," I said. "But you've been planning your own destruction much longer than that." Mark looked up, confusion clouding his features. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "Every time you called me worthless, every time you dismissed my achievements, every time you made me feel small and insignificant." I leaned forward, my voice steady and clear. "You convinced yourself I was nothing without you. That made it easy for you to overlook what I was actually capable of." The truth was settling over him like a suffocating blanket. Mark was beginning to understand that his greatest mistake hadn't been underestimating me financially, it had been underestimating me as a human being. His arrogance had blinded him to the possibility that the woman he'd spent years diminishing might have been building something extraordinary in the shadows. "The worst part," I continued, "is that if you had just treated me with basic respect, with even a fraction of the love you promised me 15 years ago, we could have shared all of this, the patent money, the success, the future. Instead, you chose to make me your enemy." Mark's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. "Claire, please, we can work this out. Whatever you want, the house, alimony, anything. Just, please don't destroy me completely." The pleading in his voice might have moved me once, but I remembered the October evening at this very table, when he'd called me useless in front of our friends. I remembered months of systematic humiliation, the way he'd paraded Vanessa around like a trophy while treating me like damaged goods he couldn't wait to discard. "You already destroyed yourself. Mark, you spent money you didn't have, borrowed against assets you didn't control, and built a lifestyle you couldn't sustain. All I did was stop subsidizing your delusions. But the accounts? You could have warned me. You could have told me." "Told you what? That you were spending my money, that your entire post-divorce life was funded by the credit of the woman you called worthless." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You wouldn't have believed me. You were so convinced of my failure that you never bothered to look deeper." Mark stared at the scattered papers on the table, the evidence of his debt, his lies, his complete financial ruin. "What happens now?" "Why now you face the consequences of your choices. The credit card companies will want their money. The banks will call in their loans. Your lifestyle, your reputation, your future with women like Vanessa, all of it evaporates. And you just walk away with your millions while I lose everything." I stood up, gathering my purse and the envelope of documents. Around us, the restaurant continued its normal rhythm business deals being made, relationships being celebrated, lives moving forward. But at our table, one life was ending and another was beginning. "Mark, you called me useless. You told everyone I was nothing without you. You made me believe, for a while, that maybe you were right." I looked down at him, this man who had once held such power over my sense of self-worth. But I was never nothing. I was just invisible to you. The final irony was perfect. Mark had been so busy performing his success for the world that he'd never noticed his wife was actually achieving it. While he sold other people's innovations and took credit for market trends, I was creating something that would change lives and generate wealth for decades to come. Everything you mocked me for my late nights in the lab, my scientific pursuits, my supposed lack of practical value, all of it led to something you could never have imagined. I didn't just survive your cruelty, Mark. I transcended it. I turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mark. The next time you think about calling someone useless, remember this moment. Remember what it feels like to discover that the person you destroyed was actually worth more than you could ever dream of being. Mark remained seated as I walked away, staring at the wreckage of his life spread across the table. By the time I reached the restaurant's exit, he was already on his phone, probably calling his lawyer, his bank, or maybe just someone who might still take his call. I stepped into the Cleveland afternoon sunshine, breathing deeply for what felt like the first time in years. The weight of secrecy, of performance, of calculated patience, lifted from my shoulders. I was no longer playing a role or hiding my true self. I was Claire Morrison, patent holder and millionaire. I was the woman who had turned scientific brilliance into generational wealth. I was the survivor who had transformed her husband's cruelty into the fuel for her own spectacular revenge. And Mark Whitmore. He was exactly what he'd always accused me of being: nothing. Thank you so much for listening to this story of revenge and resilience. I'd love to hear from you. Please comment below and let me know where you're listening from so we can connect with fellow story lovers around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts about Claire's journey from humiliation to triumph. Your engagement means everything to storytellers like us.